Now, which doesn't belong? Which? The square doesn't belong. Why? It's green. You've changed the rules again. A minute ago, you said the A doesn't belong because it's alphanumeric. It's not a geometric shape. Now the square is green, and you say the square doesn't belong, but it belonged just a minute ago. What have you done? Changed the rules. Did you stop and process and think through that? Or did it happen just like that? Because now you default to a color pattern instead of a geometric shape pattern. Now hang with me, because all of this is going to come into play later on. Do you trust me on that? Okay, it will. For example, we're living, let's call this a rapidly changing environment. We're living in a rapidly changing urban environment. We're living in an environment where denominational life is changing. A lot is going on in the world in which we live. Church life is changing. Associations are being formed that aren't geologically or geographically based. They're, all over the world. Internet, other things have come along. The rules are changing all around us. And sometimes we keep trying to argue that the A doesn't belong when now the box is green. Because that's the way it was a few minutes ago. And it's always worked before. You realize as the rules change, as the environment changes, we've got to change the rules. And that's not a bad thing. That's not a disloyal thing. But it's sometimes a very hard thing. It's easy with shapes, but it's hard when we start thinking about church. I mean, when missionaries went to the foreign fields, they went to Africa. You know what they did? They would reach Africans with the gospel, and then they would recreate Southern-style houses of worship over in Africa, because that's what church was. The mind instinctively views the world in terms of patterns. Instinctively, we develop biases and assumptions about the way the world is. You just did it in a little exercise, but we do that instinctively in our own patterned way of thinking. Things like stereotypes, prejudices. These are just patterned ways of thinking. We talk about mental models and paradigms. These are just patterned ways of thinking. Our beliefs and our mindsets influence our perception of reality. Let me take you back to that statement I made earlier. We don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we think it is. We see the world through our filters and mindsets and patterns. We tend to seek out information that supports our beliefs and to reject or devalue information that doesn't. Let's go back to Copernicus, Galileo. When they started presenting their arguments, the church dismissed what they said, wouldn't even hear it for the longest time. So they took the information, they took the observations, and they just discounted them and said, "You're wrong," because they had a prescribed way of thinking. Once a mindset has taken root, it is hard to dislodge it. Once you start thinking a certain way, it's hard to change the way you think. And we'll look at why in just a minute. But let's go back to Jesus and the disciples. Here Jesus is, the Son of God, and they said early on in his ministry, no man ever spoke like this man. Right? And yet, how long did it take Jesus to really convince the disciples that he was the Messiah, the Son of God, and that he had to go to the cross and die and suffer for our sins and be raised on the third day? When did they become convinced? After the resurrection. Yeah. But they had 3 years of teaching from the Master. Do you realize how difficult it is to dislodge pattern thinking? The primary way to do it, primary way to dislodge a mindset, is to present it with overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Mindsets will only change gradually after repeated exposure to new information. But they can change. Some of you here were products of World War II, the World War II generation. Remember how folks felt about the Germans and the Japanese after World War II? And yet, we don't feel that way today. So those things can change. The question is, how? How do we begin to think differently? You see, you limited the way you thought by imposing a pattern that didn't really exist. And that's what the whole idea of thinking outside the box is. And this is hard. Now, here, juxtapose two ideas. We tend to think in patterns. It's difficult to think outside the box. That's why cut and paste problem solving is so easy. That's why it's so easy for us to look for something that works someplace else and just paste it over into our situation and assume it'll work. Or why we go into the past and bring it into the present, saying, well, it worked before, therefore it'll work again. There is no difference in the thinking process between it worked before, it'll work again, or it worked over there, so it ought to work here. Both of those are cut and paste thinking processes, not really thinking outside the box. Now, I'll give you one, and you're going to have to think about this one for a while. Draw the same thing and link all the dots with one straight line. We'll come back to that one. Edward de Bono was a brain researcher, still alive, I believe, from England. Began doing his work, 30 years ago. But he was looking at how the brain functions. And he developed a concept called lateral thinking. Now, in football, what's a lateral? It's a backwards pass or underhand, overhand. So essentially the idea is this. You as a football player are running in a particular pattern or path. You see opposition. And so you lateral the football over to somebody else who's in a different path and is able, hopefully, to run free, run for a big gain or for a touchdown. That's the concept of lateraling in football. Now, I couldn't come up with the image that de Bono described, so I had to borrow one from skiing. That image on the right is a skier going downhill. And several skiers have gone downhill, and they've created marks where they've skied, right? Let me tell you how the brain functions, and this is de Bono's image. Imagine the brain as a ball of ice cream. All right? You got that image somewhere in there? The brain is a ball of ice cream. And a new thought comes along like hot water and gets dropped on the ball of ice cream. And what does it do? It melts it a little bit, it rolls off, and what does it create as it goes? A depression. Yeah. So imagine that you have these droplets of water and your brain is this ice cream, and it's all these patterns. Well, what happens is when now, later on, ice cream or new water comes along, it falls into the pattern that it is most like, and so it follows that line of thought. Does that make sense? It's kind of a bit of a complex imagery. But what it says to us is, when we're faced with new situations, we automatically go back and we look for patterns. Remember all this stuff we've talked about before. We do it instinctively, reflexively, unconsciously. And we fit it into the pattern that it is most like. And it's going to follow a prescribed path. So when we face new situations, we start bringing old ways of thinking to new problems. And what De Bono and now others have said is, what we have to do is we have to learn how to lateral our thinking. We have to lateral it over to another path in order to begin to think creatively. See these postums? I'm using the postum intentionally as a symbol, because there was a fellow by the name of Arthur Fry who worked for 3M, and he was working on a project for glue and bulletin boards. And the idea was that they wanted to put up a glue that they could use on a bulletin board that people could put things up on, and then they could pull the bulletin board down and maybe relocate it someplace else or something like that. It was a really good idea, and nobody wanted it. One day, he was in church, in choir practice. Music folks love this illustration. He was in choir practice, and he noticed that people were marking their books with bookmarks. And it was like well, duh. I wonder what would happen if we put some of that glue on the back of a bookmark, then you don't ever have to worry about the bookmark falling out. Postums were born. Taking something that already exists, but lateraling, thinking differently about it, and he created the postum note. To become more creative, you need to challenge your beliefs, your assumptions, your biases, and your thought patterns. And to do that, you have to expose yourself to new information and to new thought strategies, to new ways to think. Now stop and just let that kind of soak in. We have to expose ourselves to new information. We have to learn how to think using different strategies. And we have to be willing to suspend our assumptions before we can begin to think creatively. Now that really is a mouthful, but let me just kind of unpack it a little bit. We need new input. Think of the books, magazines, radio and TV shows you watch or listen to, internet sites that you go to, conferences you attend, seminars, podcasts you listen to, conversations you have. Most of us read the same stuff year after year after year. We go to the same conferences. We talk to the same people. We listen to the same podcast. We're continually getting information that reinforces what we already think.